Hello, sports fans. Welcome to the weekly roundup at the American Prospect. We do this every Friday afternoon. I am David Dayen, executive editor. With me today, we have our writing fellow, Emma Jansen. Emma, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a long week of just thinking about Trump constantly, which I think
Yeah.
people who are not in journalism can also relate to. But it's definitely getting to me a little bit.
Yeah, it's all Trump all the time. Of course, we had the inauguration on Monday, and Donald Trump and his team have hit the ground running in an attempt to, I believe, what they have called shock and awe,
Yep.
to just sort of beat everybody into submission with a bunch of different executive actions. And so I woke up, Monday was a holiday for us. It was Martin Luther King Day. So I woke up, I think Tuesday morning, and I said, you know what? Prospect's going to be a blog now. We're just going to be an old school blog, and what we're going to do is go over every executive order and put up little stories about as many of them as we could possibly get to. And At last count, we have, I think, something like 35 different stories,
Nice.
maybe more, between 35 and 40 different stories as of right now, with more being worked on at what we're calling executive action reaction. So if you go to prospect.org, at the top of the page right now is our day 4 live blog, Executive Action Reaction. And you can get links there to all the first 3 days, so you can follow along, because it's been a lot. And I hardly know where to begin, given that we've done 40 some stories. But what I can say is that a lot of these executive actions fall into, I'd say, 3 or 4 different buckets. And we can talk about each one of those buckets, because you've done a lot of these little stories that we've put together, these little blog posts,
Mhm.
and I have as well. So we can, and by the way, in the chat, we have a link to the executive action reaction uh, 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 page on the site. And also, we welcome your questions on any of this stuff. But the first bucket that maybe we should talk about, obviously, one of the major priorities of the Trump administration is immigration.
Yep.
And I know you've written a few of these
Mhm.
about various facets of the immigration executive orders that we've already seen come into play and are already leading to action.
Yep.
So why don't you kick it off here and talk about a couple of those?
Sure. Yeah. So yesterday I wrote about the executive order, or it's kind of a series of executive orders that
Yeah.
deal with the military at the border. And so, for context, the military has been deployed to the border before. It's not like Trump is doing something completely out there that hasn't been done before. But the kind of risk of this new, I don't know, this new policy, I guess, is that Trump could do something with this act from the early 1800s. So essentially, what's happening is Trump has sent, I think, already 1,500 armed forces down to the border, and they will be armed. They have, magazines in their weapons. And among that group is 500 Marines who are actually supposed to be on standby helping with the Los Angeles wildfires, which are far
Hmm.
from over. So they are now at the border instead. And like I said, this isn't necessarily in and of itself this earth-shattering thing, but Trump has suggested that he has a willingness and almost an excitement to invoke this act called the Insurrection Act,
Yeah.
which essentially can turn the military into a civilian law enforcement force, which is kind of that's a big step, right? Like we in the US are supposed to have the military as this force that does not police us on US soil. But if this act were to be invoked down at the border, that would change. And it's very rarely been invoked. The last time it was in 1992 in Los
Hmm.
Angeles for civil unrest there. So that is kind of a scary element of amassing these troops down at the border, is just what could then be done with them in the next 90 days, roughly, if that comes to pass.
Right. Yeah, and that's really just the beginning of this. I mean, obviously, and there were multiple orders on this to seal the border,
Yeah,
to find any pretense to do so.
yeah,
One of the interesting things is that there was this moment during the transition, before the Trump's inauguration, where Stephen Miller was trying to find some pretext to reinstate Title 42. Title 42 was this public health order that was done during the pandemic to say, well, we can't let anybody into the country because they might give us COVID,
yeah,
which is ridiculous because everybody in the country was giving each other COVID. But so they were trying to find another disease like COVID
yeah,
so they could invoke Title 42. They couldn't really find it. They basically gave up. But then they said in one of the seal the border executive orders that
yeah,
uh, the border is closed to any asylum seeker who passes through a country that has a communicable disease, which is any
free
country, right?
country on
Because
earth.
the common cold is a
Yes,
communicable disease, right? So they basically have tried to find any pretext
yes,
to keep things sealed up, and that goes through all the way to one of the most expansive and wide-reaching orders that has already been struck down by a federal judge, and that is the attempt to limit and restrict birthright citizenship
yes,
to individuals who are born from people, not only people who are undocumented, but people who are, to parents who are here on tourist visas
yeah.
or who are here
Visas.
on student visas. Yeah, exactly. So there was a federal judge, and was a Reagan appointee
Hmm.
in Washington State, who I think I'm quoting this almost verbatim. He said, "This is the most unconstitutional
Yeah,
order I have ever seen. What lawyers would possibly ever want to sign off on this?"
yep.
So made his views very well known. My personal view is I think that the birthright citizenship attempt is is kind of a lunge that gives the Supreme Court and other federal judges the opportunity to smack down the Trump administration, kind of show their independence
Mm,
without having to, while overlooking other things
yeah,
that may be dubiously constitutional that are happening, particularly with respect to the border.
mm,
But this makes it seem like, oh, well, there are people looking out for us when, they're only looking at the most egregious edge cases.
yeah. I think that's a good point. I also wonder and worry if this is kind of the first step in a larger shift. Like maybe they're trying to just shift the window of what is considered an acceptable, you know, part of the Constitution to take on. And I worry that maybe over the next 4 years, or just continuing even after this administration, it will become maybe increasingly normalized to sort of attack citizenship, even though it is constitutionally enshrined. So I have that kind of worry in the back of my mind that this is just
Mm-hmm.
like many of the other executive orders, setting up very like self-consciously setting the stepping stones for future, like you were saying with the kind of public health angle, there's just this sense in so many of these executive orders that they're covering their bases and like setting almost this path forward. If, say, another pandemic happens, boom, they have this language to kind of restrict.
Right.
I just had that sense from a lot of these that, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, and you've, I think, written about this, and I have as well, that what certainly is kind of the view of many of these executive orders is, particularly around immigration, is to instill fear in the population that is vulnerable. And you live in Chicago, I live in Los Angeles. Both of those cities have very expansive immigrant populations.
Mhm.
And what I think we're both hearing is that this has had a really chilling effect, even if and there are some things we can talk about how ICE is operating and how these deportations are going around, which they
Yeah.
are beginning.
Yeah.
Um, Even if they aren't, widespread, even if they aren't targeted, in the biggest locations or whatever, there is enough of kind of a rumbling of this
Mhm.
that it's turning a lot of these immigrant communities into ghost towns.
Yeah, that is true. There's been a lot of really great reporting from local papers here in Chicago about some of these neighborhoods in Chicago that have really strong immigrant communities. And in the past few days, they have, like you said, just become ghost towns, or we've seen across the country, but here in Chicago too, some families holding their kids back from school for a few days. Chicago is an interesting case as well because right as Trump was coming into office, there was this leak saying that ICE was potentially going to target Chicago first for a major
Right.
operation. And that didn't end up happening. That kind of was potentially scuttled due to the leak. We don't know exactly what happened, but
Mm-hmm.
the fear aspect is definitely here. And part of that is, amplified by one of these new executive orders, or it's technically was issued by ICE itself, not by the president, but
Like a
it was.
memorandum, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So ICE essentially has rescinded their sensitive locations policy. And that is a policy that basically has been standing since 2011 and said, you know, ICE cannot conduct raids in sensitive locations like churches or mosques or schools or, during a funeral or during a parade.
Right.
Um, all of these kind of major parts of civic life that hospitals is a big one that were
Mm-hmm.
protected from ICE raids in or around them, and now that's gone. So that really turns the dial up on the amount of fear in a lot of immigrant communities because suddenly now there's a question of should I go to the hospital to get treatment or should I stay away
Right.
because now that is a place where ICE can enter.
And it's an attempt to have undocumented immigrants do the job of ICE for them. In
Yes.
other
Yeah.
words, to say, okay, now I'm under this constant threat. I can't really work. I can't go to school. I can't go to church. So maybe I should just leave.
Yeah.
And this is sort of known as self deportation. And everyone, any immigrant who does that is essentially doing ICE's job for them and
Yeah.
making things easier. So that's a part of it. And I talked to you yesterday. I mentioned to you that I have a relative who was made aware by the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, about an actual ICE raid at a fish market on the east side of town yesterday that detained. It only ended up detaining 3 people, and
Mhm.
one of them was an actual veteran and presented his military papers and the claim was they were forged initially. That's what ICE claimed, and then they realized that they were genuine, and they
Mhm.
let him go. And they only took 2 people, but what the expectation is that fish market, those workers are never going to come back to there again. And so you see, even if this was a raid that only ended up detaining 2 people. The ripple effects of this
Yeah.
on the people who also still work there at that particular fish market, people who go to
Yeah.
buy
Yeah.
goods at that fish market. People within the community that hear that there was a raid in Newark and are worried about that aspect of it. The ripple effects are much wider
Yeah.
than the raw numbers, and that's really the attempt. The other one of the other orders that was done, which is actually also under a lawsuit, although there hasn't been a ruling yet, is around this thing called expanded expedited removal.
Hmm.
And expedited removal is the ability to remove someone from the country without going through a legal process, without going through an immigration judge.
Hmm.
And under the Biden administration, that was restricted to within 100 miles of the border. And it was also restricted to brand new arrivals. So it was like sort of, okay, if you see someone coming over the border, you can return them to their home country, to Mexico or wherever. Now it's open to the entire country, and it's anyone who's been here 2 years or less.
Oh, wow.
So that expands massively the amount of people who are at risk from having no due process rights. I mean, even if you get a traffic ticket, you can contest that in court. This is saying we can remove you from the country with less due process than a traffic violation.
Mhm.
And that is why the ACLU is suing over that particular provision.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we see a number of ways in which the immigration system is attempting to be overhauled here, and a much more punitive sounding, at least. I don't know if it's actually more punitive, but
Yeah.
it's punitive sounding. I mean, Biden took out a lot of, engaged in a lot of deportations.
That's true.
There was a lot of activity at the border, and actually, despite Trump declaring a border emergency, in the last months of the Biden administration, there were fewer people coming over the border than at any time, not at any time, but certainly much lower than the average number of border crossings during the Trump administration.
Mhm.
So, the notion of an emergency is dubious. And the notion that the Trump administration is actually doing a lot more is a little bit dubious. But because it feels like that, it's going to have results.
Yeah, completely agree. Also kind of just diagonal to a lot of these
Yeah.
immigration focused executive orders. I also wrote about an executive order that was focused on refugees and essentially stopping a refugee resettlement policy that has been very longstanding, I think since 1980. Um, and
Yes.
so it's really interesting because Trump uses a lot of the same language in these immigration deportation focused executive orders that he does in this refugee resettlement executive order. Things like
Mm-hmm.
public safety, resources for American citizens, and public health, security. Even though refugees who are on track to be resettled in the US are some of the most security vetted populations because
Yeah.
the vets them very carefully before resettling them. So I think it's just important to note that like a lot of this language that he's using is obviously incorrect. Like there is, when we're talking about refugee communities, I think just objectively there is less of a security risk than many other populations simply because they've had to go through these really heavy security checks before they can even be settled in the United States. But he's still going to use that same rhetoric and discourse that he does for any sort of non-US born or probably non-white population that we've seen in these executive
Yeah.
orders.
Yeah, the
Just,
refugee resettlement, closing that community. I mean,
yeah,
what was it? Well over 1,000 Afghan refugees who
yeah,
were
2000.
scheduled on flights to come to the United States had those flights canceled. We had a long piece last year from Dara Lind, who works for the American Immigration Council, about the refugee program and how successful and how bipartisan it had been
Yeah,
since 1980, and including in very red areas which have embraced the
yeah,
program, places like Iowa.
totally.
And so to see that program really just wither is really distressing. I'll add one more thing that brings into what I think is underlying a lot of these executive orders, which is money, following the money. So, the very first executive order that Trump signed was actually a rescinding of something like 80 of Biden's executive actions from the past, including about 42% of all of his executive orders. And one of them, it was sort of presented as an anti-DEI measure, and we can talk about DEI in a second. But one of the orders in there, which has obviously nothing to do with DEI, was rescinding this executive order that eliminated the use of privately operated criminal detention facilities. Mm-hmm. So what that facilitates, obviously, is the ability to farm out immigration detention, in particular, these way stations that are used preparatory to deporting people, to private prison companies, to Geo Group and CoreCivic. Those are the two major private prison companies that we have in the United States. Geo Group is a company that's based in Florida whose lobbyist for a while during the first Trump administration was Pam Bondi, who is she is the Attorney General nominee for this administration. So when you get down to it, obviously there's ideological reasons why Trump is engaging in this immigration detention and deportation policy, but there's also big money involved, and there's a whole undercurrent under the surface of ice that we see of companies getting rich off of warehousing and transporting people out of the country. Yep. So we should never lose sight of that. So that was kind of one bucket, right? You have all of these immigration orders. A second bucket are a bunch of orders on American energy. The main order in this is called Unleashing American Energy, which, newsflash, it's already been unleashed. There is, for better or worse, the Biden administration was a net exporter of energy, including fossil fuel energy. The U.S. under Biden became the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. It became one of the largest, if not the largest, exporter of oil in the world. And we send out more petroleum products, oil and gas products, than we do bring in. So there is no energy emergency, but this is being used for very particular purposes to allow for more drilling, particularly in places like Alaska, to allow for lifting what was a pause on approvals of liquefied natural gas terminals, even though a federal judge had already lifted that pause. It's pushing forward and getting rid, essentially, of all permitting issues with pipelines and oil and gas terminals and really anything except for solar and wind. And wind energy in particular, solar is kind of hid under the weeds a little bit in these executive orders, but wind is really on the outs. And it seems like mostly because there was an offshore wind farm near Trump's golf course in Scotland, and he didn't like how it looked. I mean, that really is driving, I think, a lot of this. And so they have canceled all offshore wind leases in the United States on the Outer Continental Shelf. And some of those orders even attack private wind operations in the interior of the U.S. And, if you look at who are the biggest states for wind power, it's Texas and it's Iowa. And there are some others too. So this puts Trump at odds, even with some red states around wind energy in particular. During the campaign, I think Big Oil spent $400 million or something to try to get Trump elected. And they're getting their payback right now in the form of all of these executive orders, unleashing American energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Drill, baby, drill.
Yeah, Indeed. So that was the second bucket, and then a third bucket was sort of all of these things around federal employees, and
Mhm.
specifically around these DEI programs,
Yep.
right? I don't know, I don't remember if you've written anything about that specifically, but
I have not.
um, okay. But talk about it. So the idea is that this wokeness is killing America, and we have to come back in and get rid of it. But what's interesting, I think, is that it's not just sort of recent programs or things that are in that were initiated during the Biden administration. They're being up for being stopped. It's There's a civil rights law, an anti-discrimination law for federal contractors, not a law, but an executive order that dates back to Lyndon Johnson that was revoked as part of this anti-DI push. So that kind of shows you what the real intent of this is. It's just to sort of restore an imagined right to discriminate
Mhm.
within the federal government. Now, this doesn't get rid of the Civil Rights Act, doesn't get rid of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act or other, statutory restrictions on discrimination. But in the federal contract space, and the ways in which the administration can, force this different perspective in, they are certainly doing so, including by inviting individuals in the government now to inform on their own colleagues if these DI programs are being hidden within the government by giving different names or something like that. I know some very conspiratorial ideas of how the government works, but um, you know, I'm a little stunned to the aspect. I wonder what you think about this. The ways in which they're pitting government workers against one another
Mhm.
in this effort to, root out DEI.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that that is kind of the point to turn people against each other? Is that, I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to make, I guess, that question to go off on a tangent about my own question. I'm trying to
Please.
get a sense of what the point of some of these DEI orders are. Because, like you said, I saw some really false just reporting and people talking on social media, people who did think this was much further reaching and did have implications on the Equal Employment Act and all of these things. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is it meant to kind of confuse the public like that and just make us think that we're living in a country where these protections aren't enshrined? Is it
Well, of
meant to
course,
be,
of course, all these rules have to be enforced, and they have to be
yeah.
enforced by the federal government. So, in terms of the ways in which these orders are sort of modeling
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
how the Justice Department will treat these cases. The Justice Department paused all civil rights cases
Yeah.
they were working on, including cases around police departments that use violence against citizens. So they are making it very clear that
Yeah.
this is what they will tolerate, and what they won't tolerate is this is any attempt to sort of smuggle in DI stuff within the government. And I think we talked about in the immigration context this sort of climate of fear
Oh
that was
yeah,
being put
that's just
together. Yeah, go ahead.
no, it seems like a very similar, I mean, self-deportation was this idea we were talking about earlier. This could be a way of kind of just getting bureaucrats to self-remove from the government. And like if you do feel like you're living in this or working in this sort of culture of fear where your other colleagues could report you, I can absolutely see that being a motivator to leave that workplace. And so maybe it
Yeah.
is just maybe that is the point, right? To unify the federal workforce into something that Trump wants it to look
Yeah.
like.
And there are two other ways that they're doing that. One is through the work from home order, which, people across office jobs have gotten used to hybrid work environments. And if you put work from home in, the studies have demonstrated that that's going to bring people out of the government. You combine that with the hiring freeze, 90-day hiring freeze that's been put on, and that's just going to create attrition in the federal workforce. And of course, if you look at Elon Musk's Doge kind of idea, there's a heavy emphasis on the workforce and reducing the federal workforce, even though if you added up all of the salaries of the entire federal workforce, it would be about 3 to 4% of the total U.S. budget. It's a small number. This is not like a private sector operation where the real money is in labor. It's not. So there's that one aspect to it, the work from home order, and there's also this thing called Schedule F.
Hmm.
And well, it was called Schedule F, and then they changed the name because it was a big thing in Project 2025, and I think they wanted to try to disassociate with Project 2025 by calling it something different. So it's not called Schedule F anymore. It's called Schedule Policy Career, and it basically asserts that the president has the right to fire people in policy-making positions in the bureaucracy. And this is thousands of people within the federal government that would get this new designation that would strip civil service protections from them. This is seen by many as illegal. If you were given civil service protections, you can't have them stripped away from you. There are federal laws, including the Pendleton Act, Civil Service Reform Act of 1881, and the Constitution itself that protects people from having these kinds of protections taken away from them. And indeed, the American Federation of Government Employees and others have sued over this new Schedule F, but it's not called Schedule F anymore, designation. But look, if even as this works its way through the courts and it's not technically in place, if you are someone in some sort of bureaucratic position within the government and you are told that we're going to change your designation, even if it doesn't get changed yet, but we're going to change your designation to make you basically operating at the pleasure of the president and you'll be fired at any moment, that's also going to create that fear and anxiety and, create a climate where you're not going to want to really work there anymore. You're already working for less because if like-minded or similar positions in the private sector pay much better than they do in the federal government. So you're already taking that hit. If they're now saying you're going to be fired at will and at the will of Donald Trump, you're going to have problems with sticking around.
And I'm curious to see if we kind of get a better sense of this in the next days and weeks, just which sectors of the federal government are going to end up being most impacted by some of these orders, right? Like, will it be, like the EPA, or I'm just wondering which, who, if there's going to be this concentration of employees leaving in certain parts of the government that Trump might not enjoy.
Yeah, and he's firing others. He fired the head of the Coast Guard, he fired the head of the TSA, he fired the head of the Secret Service, and maybe some of those were justified and some of those weren't. But I'm also hearing about lower level career employees being fired, and at some point somebody has to run the government. Like someone has to make certain things happen that are in the normal course of current business. And usually when you're talking about, and I have a big piece coming out Monday that I'll preview very shortly here, which is about this sort of government efficiency department that Elon Musk, now solo because Vivek has been fired, has put together. they're relating it a lot to headcount. They're relating it, well, if you get rid of 3/4 of the federal workforce, then everything will be cheaper. But when you're talking about getting rid of those individuals, you still have the functions. So you're probably going to have to replace them with private contractors to do the work, who are more expensive. Or B, you're getting rid of people who protect the government from being ripped off.
Yeah.
People like procurement officers at the Department of Defense, or IRS agents who actually collect money and who make much more for the government than their own salary. So, this is an invitation to make government much less efficient. And actually, one of the ones I just put up at Executive Action Reaction, which you can go to prospect.org and find, talks about this, about how the hiring freeze in particular is playing havoc with government efficiency. The IRS has seasonal hiring. They process tax returns between now and April 15th. And if they are in a hiring freeze right now, they can't hire those seasonal workers to process tax returns. So the result is going to be, you're not going to get your refund, you're not going to get customer service, and all of those things. And that makes government less efficient. And there are examples of that, like that, all across the government. The National Park Service is another one that has seasonal hiring based on conditions in the national parks. And if they can't hire now, they can't meet those needs, those particular needs, whether it's, clearing the roads in, national park areas that are getting snow and bad weather conditions, for example. So there are a host of ways where reducing the headcount of the government actually makes the government much less efficient.
Yep. Yeah. Completely agree.
Right. Okay. So I'm trying, we did so many of these things. I'm actually looking through them now to see what else you
I can
worked on.
do a little interlude about the Delta smelt. This is one that
The Delta smelt. Yes. Talk about the Delta
Sure.
smelt for it.
So, okay, the Delta smelt is a 2 to 3 inch fish that is only present in the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta, which is in my great home state of California, our home state of California. And these fish have been thrust into the political spotlight, even though they're just trying to make a living for themselves and survive.
I don't know if they're making a living. They're not working as accountants.
It's true. And they're
They're trying to survive. Yeah.
They're trying to survive against some pretty bad odds, because essentially the way that California's water management works is that there are parts of the state that use and need more water that don't have that water already there. So we have the Delta, which is kind of up in the north of the state, and then you have south of that, the Central Valley, which is the breadbasket of America, and there's all this farming, very water intensive. And then you have Southern California, they need their reservoirs to be filled, etc. So Delta smelt live up in this river delta, and essentially back in 2019, Trump said, we need to get these sorry, he was not talking about the Delta smelt specifically. He said we need that Delta water to come from the north of the state and basically feed all of those farms. The issue with that is that pumping a ton of water out of the Delta, which is a pretty sensitive just environment, would endanger lots of fish there, not just the smelt, including the breed of salmon that lives there. And that obviously can have much bigger ramifications for the rest of the ecosystem in the Delta. It can also, when you pump fresh water out of the Delta, you can get a stream of salt water coming in, and that just completely changes the environment and can lead to these species dying off or becoming more and more endangered and putting them at risk of dying off in the future, etc. So Gavin Newsom and the state attorney general said, no, you need to do a much more thorough investigation than you actually did into the risks to these endangered species. So essentially we had this head-to-head over environmental concerns and the desire to just get more water into these big, agricultural farms down in the Central Valley. But now Trump is saying that it's actually, a fire concern, and he's using the horrible
Hmm.
fires in Southern California to create this false choice between these tiny fish and human lives and property down in Southern California. Um, he's kind of
Yeah,
trying to paint this as silly, woke Californians trying to protect this tiny fish instead of protecting their own citizens, which is not actually what the choice is, because Southern California does have mostly very full reservoirs right now, and officials
right,
in the areas that have been affected by the fires have said that, and they've said, that's not the issue that's happening, right? So this to me reads as a way of Trump kind of just painting California and other liberal states as overly concerned about the environment and not protecting their own people. That's how it read to
right.
me. That seemed like
Yeah,
the
I think that's the intention,
Mhm.
but I think the reality is, and this is a long-standing issue in California. The real uh, concern here for Trump, and actually, the people who are lobbying Trump, are the wealthy conservative ranchers and farmers in the Central Valley who just want their water. That
Mhm.
water is not intended to go to Southern California. That water is intended to
Yeah.
go to the farms making broccoli and spinach and everything else in the breadbasket of California, which is the Central Valley. And they want it cheap. And they don't want to have to pay for it. And they're using this topic of the Delta smelt to exactly paint California as kooky,
Yeah.
when actually they're just looking for handouts. So that's what this is really about,
Yeah.
rather than the what it looks like. And as you said, the relating it to the Southern California wildfires is ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
because of everything you said, the reservoirs were topped off.
Yeah.
No amount of water would have stopped the conflagration
Yeah.
in the hills, given the winds, given the embers that were flying around and everything. Donald Trump, I guess, is going to be here within about, not my house, but here within about 8 miles of here,
Cool.
in Pacific Palisades today. He is coming out for a viewing of the damage. So I'm sure he'll have more to say about the fish
Yep.
later today. And which actually reminds me, because also this week, in addition to the executive action stuff, you wrote something that was about the Southern California wildfires that ran in the beginning part of the week, about the use of incarcerated personnel to fight these fires,
Yeah.
um, which they did an admirable job doing. But tell me about these incarcerated firefighters, and why they are enlisted in this project.
Yeah, definitely. So over the course of the fires in Southern California, we saw roughly 1,000 incarcerated firefighters being sent down to help. And I think I heard a lot of people kind of realizing for the first time on social media and just in daily life, folks that I talk to, that wildfires are often actually in California tackled by incarcerated firefighters. And this is a pretty big program
Mm-hmm.
within the California prison system. So I wanted to just look into that and also connect it to one of the propositions that we saw in the election in California last November, which essentially Californians had the chance to outlaw prison slavery, for for good, and they decided not to. So
Mm-hmm.
essentially, the status quo in California is that prisoners can be forced to work, right? Like if someone is given a work assignment within prison, and if they say no, they can be punished for that. They
Right.
are forced to work. Um, and so if this proposition had been passed in California, that would no longer be the case. There would still be work within the prison system, and a lot of people probably still would be working, but there would at least be a choice. You could say no and you would not be punished for that. Um, so, I think that was just as someone who grew up in California and had this idea of the state as this sort of like liberal paradise when I was young. It's just is very jarring when Californians are given the chance to reject something that is objectively a form of slavery and they don't. Um, so back to the kind of where this ties into fires and firefighting, uh, the role of an incarcerated firefighter is actually one of the rare voluntary positions within the prison work system. So you cannot be forced, if you are an incarcerated person in California, you cannot be forced to go fight fires. It's a choice that you are given and that you have to make yourself. Um, and according to some
Hmm.
people who have served in these roles, it is probably objectively one of the better roles in terms of work opportunity and you know, pay, even though they are still making far below minimum wage and far below what a non-incarcerated firefighter would be making. But people say that you leave the prison walls and you leave the abusive prison guards and just the like quite literally carceral environment, and you go and you live in a fire camp, um, out in nature. You hike, you run, you train out there. Um, Families can come for picnics, some people say, on visiting days, and there are literally no fences. So
Hmm.
that difference, I can absolutely see why people would choose, to take on that role. But when I spoke to some folks who understand how the prison system works, I talked about the idea that it's difficult to actually have a choice when you are in these conditions and when
Mm.
slavery is still kind of upheld within the prison system. How much of a choice is it really when you're choosing between being outside, no walls, guards are not kind of berating you and physically and emotionally versus that environment where you're quite literally behind bars and have little to no access to like workout machines and time outside and things like that. So I think the story that I was trying to tell with that piece is just that even though incarcerated firefighters in California do accept that role voluntarily, when we still have that status quo of prison slavery upheld, it's difficult to conceive of any role for an incarcerated person as truly voluntary.
Right.
And truly, the answer should be getting rid of slavery within California's prisons. And then the work conditions, while I think there will still be immense problems with them, can at least become slightly more tolerable and equal, and we can start
Yeah.
tackling those problems in a better way.
And I guess that they're going to try again with a
Yes,
ballot measure, maybe in 2026. So we'll see what
possibly.
happens there. So okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to go to a question that we got a while ago, and I didn't get to it. It's from Jared Panikid, who says, do you think there'll be a nuclear renaissance or a huge tailwind for advanced geothermal? This was in relation to our energy discussion about energy executive orders. The energy executive order that removes some permitting or attempts to remove some permitting hindrances. It mentions pipelines, oil and gas pipelines by name. It does mention nuclear by name. It does not mention geothermal by name. It says hydropower, which is also a renewable energy source. But maybe geothermal gets in there. I think it depends on how good their lobbyists are. I mean, I think
Yeah.
what we've seen in this early days of this administration is that where you stand depends on where your money is. We saw it on Monday. I would be remiss in saying the tableau on Monday at the inauguration, where you had the richest men in the world standing in front of Trump's cabinet during the swearing in ceremony. I think that was just incredibly revealing. So if there are a bunch of lobbyists that are going to, pay tribute to the king on nuclear, then yeah, nuclear is probably going to do okay. Same with geothermal, but I don't think that the stuff's going to be unleashed unless Trump stops sitting on it and decides that that's where he wants to go. I think it's very clear that the order is really about fossil fuel energy. I mean, it's everything around it, not just the unleashing energy in order itself, but every other order on top of that, the energy emergency, the one about Alaska. The one about Alaska is very interesting, by the way, because there was this other executive order where Trump's like renaming things, right?
Yes.
Where he's renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and renaming Denali in Alaska after Mount McKinley. The Denali thing is actually very controversial and unpopular among Republicans within Alaska who have tribes in their area and native peoples in their state, and have generally agreed that Denali, which means the great one in the Athabasca language, is what should be the name of that mountain. So they actually petitioned the government way back when it was changed to Denali officially to do so, and they were not happy with Trump trying to change it back to William McKinley because he's a big fan of William McKinley's from the 1890s, because he thinks that the world works still the way that it did at the end of the 19th century. So then it almost seemed like, to compensate for that, Trump also put forward a second executive order that was all about all the great things we can do stealing the natural resources of Alaska. Yeah. Opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, opening up Tongass National Park to logging, opening up a particular road that was stalled in process that would facilitate mining.
Just rescinding all of the kind of previous regulations on
all that stuff.
Drilling in Alaska. Yeah.
So when they asked, Dan Sullivan is one of the two senators from Alaska, and when they asked him about the Denali situation and the renaming of Denali as Mount McKinley, he's like, well, look at this other order. This is great. He's going to unleash energy in Alaska. So it was almost like this transactional thing, like, yeah, you'll give me what I want, which is Mount McKinley, and I'll give you what you want, which is stealing all the natural resources of Alaska. I think that, so that was just sort of as a sidelight, that was kind of interesting to me. But as I said, I think all of the energy orders in general are about fossil fuels, and that to the extent that nuclear or hydropower or geothermal would get a boost from it, it's incidental, if anything.
Yep, that sounds right.
So, all right. So we have a few minutes left. I could go rapid fire and mention all of the other things that we did on executive orders this week. But maybe I will hold that off for another time, because you can read it. You can go to prospect.org and check out our executive action reaction, which we're going to continue to do through today. And now next week, we move into sort of a regular order. And maybe we'll, in the few minutes we have left, do a preview of what you've got in store for us, in particular next week, because we have a new issue which should be getting to people's mailboxes, a print issue. We actually do that. We still use a Dead Tree edition, and we put that together, before the inauguration, in preparation for what was going to happen. And your piece in particular in that next issue, which we're going to run early next week, is about preparation. It's about people who are preparing for the reality of this heightened deportation, heightened enforcement of the immigration laws in the U.S. So tell us about what you wrote about in that story.
Yeah, definitely. I wrote about how various people, groups, and just forms of civic life are preparing for this threat of mass deportation, which we knew about far before Trump was inaugurated, but now is very clearly kind of coming to pass through these executive orders. And so it all kind of started with this couple who one of them was born in the US, is a US citizen, and the other is undocumented. And they told me their story about kind of falling in love, being high school sweethearts, and eventually deciding to get married. And all of that, their love story was kind of happening with the backdrop of Trump's rise to power in 2016. And then again, this couple, the man voted for the first time in 2020, and now Trump is back in power right as they got married. They had their marriage date set before Trump was elected, so they were always going to get married, but now there is this kind of added political element to it, right? About protecting the wife's ability to stay in the US and also her nuclear family's ability to do so as well. So I started with that, but I also got a look at how immigration nonprofits and legal services are rethinking things to prepare for Trump. How, teachers, because the husband of this couple that I wrote about, he is a teacher as well. So getting a sense of how
In an
school
area that has a lot of undocumented students, right?
exactly, that has a lot of immigrant students. And so he told me that teachers are kind of having these meetings, during lunchtime, very informal, where they're just talking about what they're afraid of and what happens if ICE does come into schools, which now with this
Right.
sensitive areas policy is much more of a reality. So just getting a sense of how everyone is preparing for this. And it is really interesting to kind of look back on the process of reporting that story before things like the sensitive areas policy came out. Now, I
Right.
think a lot of the concerns people had then have become very founded in reality
Yeah.
now. So I'd be interested, honestly, in kind of returning to that same question and doing more reporting now that it's not just preparation, it's actually reality today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at attendance records of
Yeah,
some of
exactly.
these heavily immigrant community high schools and
Yeah.
elementary schools, things like that, for example. And I think it would be interesting just follow along with how immigration attorneys are feeling, how immigration judges are dealing with the chaos happening and whether their courtrooms are being pushed to process more cases, get more people out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a really good piece, and it was prescient. It really prefigured a lot of the things we're already seeing here in the first week of the Trump administration. So yeah, thank you for that. We're going to put that out, and as I mentioned, we're going to have a big piece on Doge that's going to come out on Monday that you can check out. So I guess that's about it. We only have a minute or so left. I will just once again say, the kinds of things that we're doing this week, where we are relentlessly focused on the actual things that are happening, not a tweet, not a comment,
Yeah.
not a stray remark, but the actual things that are happening, which ones are actually important, which ones are not important, frankly, what they mean to you, and who is benefiting. And that is really our mission at the Prospect. We want to ground this in the reality of what is happening on the ground in people's lives. And so we are, I'm really happy with how we have covered this in the first week. Focus on these stakes and making sure that everyone understands what's actually going on, and they can use that as a tool to inform themselves or to engage in activism or whatever they want. So we're going to keep doing that. Prospect.org. You can come there every day. We're gonna be hitting it pretty hard. Emma Jansen will be there writing relentlessly as well. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
And thank you to those of you watching. We're going to put this up at the website so you'll be able to watch this discussion. And we're here every Friday at 12 8:30 Eastern. We will be back next week. And until then, thank you very much and have a great day.
Take care, everyone.